Okay, hi everybody. So thanks for that. So let me just be quick so a lot of other people can jump in. So I think there are two questions. One basically is the difference between the 2.0 and the 3.0. I'm not quite sure that you've characterized it the way I think it might be more fruitfully characterized. And the second question kind of follows from that. So you sort of went through this history 1.0, substance dualism, or the whole idea of an ontology of mind and body, as distinct substances. That was Descartes' problem. And then 2.0 became this issue of reduction, okay? And what I would have thought was that the change from Descartes to, 20th century, say, philosophy of mind was, what? Hello? Hello?
I can still hear you.
Okay. That the change was from the question was the idea that, yes, we abandon substance dualism for, some form of materialism, where you have the ontological question of, how are the mind and body related? Well, mind is a material thing, but then there's issues about, property dualism and that sort of thing. But there was also this change in the epistemological aspect of Descartes not having a science of the mind and not thinking that a science of the mind was possible and not existing, to the idea that once you give up substance dualism, then suddenly the sciences become relevant as the sources of evidence for whatever you're going to do, right? So what changed from 1.0 to 2.0 was this dual aspect of the ontological question of their relationship given materialism, and how psychological and neurosciences are related, how the sciences of the mind, which are now permissible or are actually relevant to the question, how those are related. So from 1.0 to 2.0, you had an expansion of the space to both the ontological question, it's somewhat reformulated, to also including now this epistemological question where introspection wasn't doing it. Now it's the sciences, and how are the relevant sciences that correspond to mind and body, roughly speaking, how are they related? Okay, so reduction, this is where I sort of part ways with the way you've characterized. Reduction always included both aspects. Reduction was both an ontological issue and an epistemological issue. And this comes from, Hegelian reduction was epistemological, right? But you also have, the other people giving a more ontological reading. But reduction was always both, right? And so that's what sort of creates for me a problem when you sort of go to the next stage of 3.0, where it remains an epistemological issue of, how are these two sciences related? So I don't see a 3.0, I just see 2.0, a component of that you are focusing on, but not a new stage, at least not in that sense, right? So that's my first sort of question is, I don't see, I'm not sure that the transition that you see from 2.0 to 3.0 is if there is a transition, I don't think it's been characterized in the most illuminating way. The second question is kind of related to this. I really, for very similar reasons, I question the relevance of the Putnam peg and hole example. The peg is, I assume, supposed to be the theory of psychology, and the hole is supposed to be, I don't know, the theory of neuroscience. I mean, this is, it's totally like not helpful or illuminating to use that. I mean, it may have been at the time to say something about those theories, but that's like, we saw that in 2.0, and that's not telling us anything about what's going on in 2.1 or, 2.1a or whatever you want to call it. I think, and this is another issue, is that the peg hole thing is probably also counterproductive, because it basically illustrates the two-level picture, psychology and neuroscience. And I would think that, what's going on today is a lot of, the question is not autonomy, but because that seems to be an old, one of the questions from the, last century. But this question seems to be more like, how do we actually integrate these things, which is just developing the epistemological aspect of 2.0. It's not a separate thing. And in that, the peg hole example is completely counterproductive. And just to kind of wrap that up and wrap my comments up, I think Trey Boone and Gualtiero Piccinini had a nice paper fairly recently on, the cognitive science, neuroscience revolution. And their point is that, nowadays, this whole two-level picture is just the wrong way to go, right? I mean, we need to start thinking about lots of different levels, lots of different ways of integrating, right? So that is, that's more detail on the same project as far as I understand it. But I also would question whether the Putnam-Pagan whole thing is really relevant, or if it's in fact just counterproductive. Okay, that's it.
Well, thank you, Carrie. I very much appreciate your insightful comments, and it's a lot to think about. Let me try to say something in response to both issues. I won't be able to address them in full just because they're so rich, but let me begin where I agree. I completely agree that the story I've given of the transition from 1.0 to 2.0 is somewhat oversimplified. I agree with you that reduction has an ontological component and has an epistemic component. I can definitely do a better job both in my talk version and in the paper and making that clear. But this gets to the heart of your, not objection, but the heart of your question, which is there really a 3.0? And let me begin there with your second point. The Putnam analogy has been immensely influential in the philosophy of science, and we can discuss now, is it fruitful to talk about squares, holes and pegs? But the same structure was used across the board in philosophy of science. So Philip Kitcher, when he developed his 1953 and all that argument against reductionism, pretty much applied the same insight to genetics. Garfinkel did the same thing when it comes to ecology. I think Fodor was partly responsible for generating that example himself, and then used it quite a bit in his work. So I don't disagree that I don't disagree that perhaps the example itself is not as fruitful as people made it out to be, but it has shaped the field. And so what's new in 3.0? From my perspective, what's new is that the field as we have it now has reached somewhat of a stalemate. Reduction, for the last 20 years, reductionists have been rehashing their point, and anti-reductionists have done exactly the same. And we have reached, it's not even an agreeing to disagreeing. It's, I think, a verbal dispute now. So in trying to come up with a 3.0, I'm not saying, look, let's start from scratch. Can we find a better way to characterize these differences? And your point is well taken. I need to work on my presentation in the paper and make it crisper. Exactly what's different, but we need to move away from the square peg round hole two-level picture that Piccinini was criticizing recently, and I agree. And I'm trying to develop a framework for doing that. And I think the key is abandoning the assumption that Putnam was partly responsible for triggering, that we're asking the same questions at whether it's 2 levels, 3 levels, or 16 levels. They're not different questions. And this is an assumption anti-reductionists made, but I think it got lost in translation somewhere.
So I I have one big concern. I have a lot of interesting, I think there's a lot of good points in your paper, but I think it's probably more useful if I try to focus on the worries. My main worry, and in order to cash it out completely, I have to commit myself to being a little bit like the devil's advocate, is concerning the fact that the mind-body problem 3.0 is still a version of the mind-body problem. It is related to mind-body problem. So, as far as I understood your idea, what you propose is the mind-body problem 3.0 is the problem of the mixed autonomy of psychology with respect to neuroscience. So psychology is supposed to be autonomous, but at the same time, neuroscience contributes to our understanding of the mind or the psychological properties. So now, well, first of all, I think this problem might be only contingently related to the mind-body problem with a sort of capital M, B, and P, because, well, first of all, we have the same question about autonomy about other sciences. So, for example, there is a problem of autonomy maybe in biology or economics, and then is there a sort of mind-body problem for biology and for economics? Well, some people, and here I'm going back to the ontological nature of the mind-body problem as it was maybe as it emerged with Descartes, the core of the mind-body problem, I think, still in contemporary time for some people is that the mind seems to be specially autonomous in comparison to all the other higher order levels of phenomena. And that's why some people, of course, rephrased it as the hard problem, into the only real hard problem. So I was thinking that to substantiate a little bit more this worry, maybe we can try to think about it in these terms. Consider that, I mean, to my mind, we can imagine a future in which we solved your mind-body problem, or let's say in a different way, that we can imagine that the mind-body problem is neither sufficient, not necessary to solve the ontological mind-body problem. So we can solve the mind-body problem 3.0, but this is still neither necessary nor sufficient to solve the ontological mind-body problem. So people would still be dissatisfied, even if we solve the mind-body problem 3.0. So it is not sufficient, because I think we can easily imagine that it can turn out that psychology is autonomous, but in a sense, mental properties simply co-vary with brain properties. So in a sense, in principle, we could derive all the truths about psychology or the mental purely with thinking about psychological properties, but studying the brain is just easier. It's a heuristic because there is this kind of covariation, and it doesn't need to be any relationship of strong supervenience or reduction or identity. We can just think there are many ways, many reasons why the psychological properties and the brain properties might co-vary. Although, so this would mean that there's no problem of autonomy because psychology is autonomous. What neuroscience does is not really adding anything. It's just a way to discover psychological truths about psychology that is easier for us because studying the brain is, we don't have to deal with introspection. We don't have to deal with things that are hardly measurable. So it's just easier. So this means that we could solve the mind-body problem 3.0, but still some people would say, hey, I mean, if these two things co-vary, but we don't understand what's the metaphysical relationship between the two properties, mental and physical properties, the mind-body problem is not solved. So this is not sufficient. But some people might also think that it's not necessary to solve mind-body problem 3.0 because, well, two orders of reasons. Sorry if I open so many options, but so what the first reason is that it might turn out that the higher level explanations are in fact not autonomous, maybe because we end up being able to predict any psychological state, looking at the state of the brain. So at a certain point we start thinking, well, we can just get rid of the psychological explanations or psychological talk So in a case, it is not autonomous anymore, but from a metaphysical point of view, this option is still compatible with even with some dualism if you want. You could say, yes, okay, again, there is some strong necessitation between the two, but maybe there is property dualism, maybe there is non-interactive dualism, maybe there is epiphenomenalism, who knows? Still the mind-body problem, the ontological one, is not solved. Or it might turn out that the lower level, this is the second option, the second way in which it might not be necessary to solve 3.0, to solve the mind-body problem. It might turn out that the lower level explanations actually, in some cases, don't add anything to psychology. So there's a psychological phenomenon that is just completely immune to any kind of contribution from neuroscience. And I think this is very speculative, but it's the only example I kind of thought about. That if you have a very successful functionalist theory, or even one of these weird theories like free energy or integrated information theory, in principle, they claim they are able to explain everything about the mind, or everything about phenomenology, or everything about consciousness, without necessarily needing any details about the neural mechanisms. I mean, of course, neural mechanisms, looking at neuroscience would be a way to test the theory, because we could falsify the theory if the prediction goes wrong, but it's not a contribution in the sense of like a substantive contribution to the formulation of the theory. So, to wrap up, if solving 3.0 is neither sufficient nor necessary to solve the one and only mind-body problem, I wonder if 3.0 is not only different from 2.0, as Carrie said, but it is a version of the mind-body problem in the first place. Or it's just a connected issue, but it's not the mind-body problem.
Thank you. There's, again, a lot to think about. And a lot of these issues, they're very interesting from my perspective because I wasn't thinking about them along these lines. So that's very helpful. So thank you very much. I want to answer three different threads. So you made a lot of points, but I'm going to restrict my attention to three, which I'm hoping are the core issues. First, I'm going to begin with the very end. You end up by saying maybe this is not a version of the one and only mind-body problem. Perhaps, but I don't want to get bogged down too much here in labels. If we as a community stipulate that, look, only Descartes' questions is worthy of the label mind-body problem, then be it. My title is somewhat provocative. I think my concern is, I believe that this is an important issue, whether we call it mind-body problem or Frank. I'm not that concerned, but your point is well taken. And this raises a very important point, which is the way I'm characterizing what I call the mind-body problem 3.0. It's not an issue that pertains specifically to the mind. You're absolutely right. If there's a mind-body problem 3.0, there's also a biology-physics problem 3.0. It's the same problem in biology physics, the same problem in economic psychology. So there's a sense in which I am denying the specialty of the mind. And some people might not like that. And this goes, I think, to the second point you were raising. And you say, look, but philosophers of mind have a very special way to talk about the mind as specific. The hard problem of consciousness doesn't arise anywhere else. I mean, that's a huge issue. It deserves a discussion in and of itself, which I'm not addressing here. To share my stance with you guys here, I will be much more deflationary when it comes to the hard problem of consciousness. So I recognize there's an issue there. Personally, I think it's not as crucial, it's not as central as many other people have made it to be. Having said this is a matter of opinion. We can have a long discussion, but it's not an issue I'm addressing here. So implicitly in my discussion is there's nothing that special about the mind. We should put the mind-body problem in the context of the relationship between the sciences. Hey, I'm a philosopher of science, so you can see where I'm coming from. But a lot of people might disagree with that. And then the third issue, again, I guess pertains to this. Wait, maybe you addressed the third issue in passing. Yes, the long story short, you're right. I'm focusing on, I'm broadening the mind-body problem. I'm denying the specialty of the mind. Some people might, oh yeah, sorry, the third issue was when you said we're already dealing with these problems, with issues of supervenience, of covariation. What I'm trying to do essentially is provide a framework for systematizing. I think talk of covariation it might have been very interesting in philosophy. It hasn't been that helpful. In scientists tend not to talk in those terms. It hasn't been that catchy, that effective. So what I'm doing here is reframing. I'm not saying, look, everyone's got it wrong. It's like, maybe let's try to re-ask similar questions in a different guise. And what I'm hoping is to provide a framework in which other people can come in and say, look, we can make sense of covariation now along these lines. We can make sense of supervenience. We can make sense of grounding and so forth. But I think whether or not my framework works, and this is something, of course, we can debate, and it's not obvious by any means, I think we do need a new framework for applying a lot of the new philosophical discussions and make them relevant to scientific issues. I'm hoping to do that. We'll see if it works.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Matteo.
I'm going to start with a comment that sort of relates to these, tries to see how these worries that were just articulated you may address by your own framing in the paper, and then I'll follow up with a question that also relates to that framing. So you also said in the talk that you want to show the relevance of philosophy of science to this question. And I think, like in the paper and also in the presentation, you didn't put this enough up front. Like, I think you can, because you had to apologize sort of for all this sketchy history, but I think you can like kind of reframe it positively if you say, I'm looking at this question or these sets of questions from a philosophy of science perspective in the first place, right? Like nobody's gonna write like an exhaustive history of like 4 centuries of science in a paper, but like what I want to do is to look at from the philosophy of science angle at that question, and then show how problematic notions or notions that have been problematized in philosophy of science, such as reduction, and I would say in terms of Descartes also causation, right? Because it's like a certain view of causation or a problem, how to build causation into a picture that sort of underlies perhaps the intractability of that issue. So I'm sort of more sympathetic, I think, to this sort of distinction between these different types of questions. But what I'm missing is that if that's really what you want to say, that you address this a bit more upfront by saying, like, look, if we looked at this problem from a philosophy of science angle, that's what we get. And it's very different than, or it's somewhat different than looking from a mainly philosophy of mind perspective, where you start with like the specialness of the mind and phenomenal properties and all that sort of stuff and phenomenology. And that's not what you're doing, right? You're like talking about methodology in science. So I think that might be like a positive way of addressing like some of these worries and articulating more precisely what you're doing. So my question to this regard is also with how you use kind of different formulations in your throughout your talk. So for instance, you said that sort of 1.0 and 2.0 got resolved, sort of dissolved, and that, but then you also talk about reframing that question, and so as if it's like the mind-body problem. So there's like one mind-body problem, and it can be framed in different ways, and it needs reframing, and that we have to change the framing, and to me that sounds like at least 3 different types of meta-philosophical positions that you're maybe conflating, or maybe should keep more distinct or make more explicit where it stands. So the first would be dissolution, right? So dissolution would be to say that the formulation of Descartes as an ontological question or also these other, and also 2.0 at the question of reduction, has conceptual issues that you cannot actually solve constructively. So for instance, Peter Heckler, right, has this position that like the dualism, substance dualism, suffers from the problem that you can't conceptualize how a non-physical event causes anything physical. So that's like a conception. It doesn't have anything to do with empirical research. It has to do something with that we cannot conceptualize how that works in the first place. And he and perhaps some others think that that's sort of like insurmountable, and therefore substance dualism is like a conceptually bankrupt position. And perhaps one could claim that about if you're right about reduction and it's merely a labeling, then it might also be that this is conceptually impossible to solve because you can just sort, as you said, and I tend to agree, like you can just fight over the examples forever and you will not solve it because perhaps reduction is not the right conceptualization of the problem. So, but that means there's really like an issue, and there's like that those need to be resolved, so they're like really should be put aside, right? So it has like this evaluative character. Then the second, more positive way of framing it would be that that we actually made progress on this problem because there is now a proliferation of questions. So just as in science, right, you start like perhaps with like one question about like a phenomenon, and then you realize like once you find something out about this phenomenon that there's actually many different questions that involve different types of answers and that involve different types of methodology to be answered. And so there's a sort of like subtyping of the problem into different problems that are not the same, but they coexist. And at some points in the paper or also in the talk, you seem to be sounding like you wanted to say that, right? So that they sort of coexist. But that's a different position, I think, than saying it's the solve because of conceptual like intractability. And then the third one is that it's neither dissolution or proliferation, but maybe a problem of adequate formulation. So that you say, well, there is just one mind-body problem, but we need the right characterizations of that problem, right? So whereas dissolution might be more like a Wittgensteinian idea of like we just have to therapeutically get rid of it, and Rorty and some others had this view. Adequate formulation is really now like, no, there is a substantial problem. There's also perhaps a hard problem of the mind-body relation, but we haven't settled into the right formulation. And if you take that perspective, for instance, you could also ask, well, maybe is psychology really the right science of the mind, right? And like some people might debate that. Some people may say, well, what about cognitive science that brings together like artificial intelligence and linguistics and computer science and philosophy and psychology? So it's really like no one discipline will answer that relation. Or you might think computer science is like the science because you're like a computationalist, or you might think physics because of free energy principle. So I hope you're seeing sort of where I'm getting with this is like you haven't told us exactly enough where you stand with this framing, and that leaves certain things unanswered then that one might hope you could answer by putting it in this philosophy of science angle.
Well, thank you, Philip. These are excellent points. And again, just like with Carrie and Matteo's issues, this is very helpful for me because, as I said, it's working in progress, and it's really helping me reframe some of my own framing issues. Right. The short answer is I agree. I agree that I need to be a lot more careful in stating my position, and this is very helpful. But let me just add a point to address hopefully both your concerns at once. So you began by suggesting maybe I should explicitly emphasize that what I'm doing here is taking a philosophy of science angle, and I agree with half of this. Meaning, yes, I need to be much more upfront that I'm addressing these issues from a very specific perspective. But I also at the same time don't want to give the impression that I'm saying, well, there's a philosophy of science mind-body, and then there's a philosophy of economics mind-body, because I do feel that it's time to move on from some questions. I think to some extent they to some extent, Descartes' question of ontology has been addressed. Sure, we can still, we can still talk about it, but it's not central any longer. And I would say the same thing about the question of reduction. This goes back to my very interesting, my fruitful conversation with Carrie. I need to be more clear, like exactly what am I suggesting here, but I need to make clear that I think we've dead-ended. Wherever the discussion was going, we need to shift. So I'm not just saying, here's another take on the mind-body problem. At the same time, and this is a controversial claim, and I don't expect everyone or anyone to be necessarily in agreement with me, but I do feel that we should reorient the discussion somewhere else. And this goes back to my discussion with Matteo here. I'm offering some suggestions. Are these necessarily the best ones? No, but I'm hoping that the parse destruence of my talk comes through. Where we are right now, we're not making much progress. And my positive contribution is to reframe this in a way that I hope will be conducive down the line to more progress. For this to happen, you're absolutely right. I need to be clear. What do I mean by dissolving here? You're also right. It's a Wittgensteinian metaphor. How helpful is it? I'm not sure, but I need to be much more clear. How does the mind-body 3.0 relate to 2.0? Again, and here I'm going back to my discussion with Carrie, I think the crucial issue is that this idea of shifting questions between levels. Is that a kind of dissolution? The paper needs to be clear in this respect. You're touching on a live wire there, and you're absolutely correct. But at the same time, I don't want to imply that, well, here's another cute question. I think these are scientifically pressing issues. Yeah. And many others are not, in my opinion.
Just a quick comment. No, I think, and again, let me just restate that I think like the project, I'm definitely sympathetic to your project in particular, because I think so, for instance, from my philosophy education, you get exactly this. Philosophical questions are these immutable questions, right? We're asking the same questions as Aristotle did or Descartes did. And so I think you're really touching on something, that these questions are situated with respect to the science of the time and also, of course, other factors, and that we need this updating, and that you're saying that we can only make progress by also updating that problem is completely the right way to go. But I think that all of that, and also this emphasis on philosophy of science, can be brought out much more in front, and then people may be easier to convince that will be this contribution, right, and won't get stuck on, but what about, and so on, like if you're just like more clear. But yeah, thanks.
Amen. Thank you, Philip.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Marco. Now, I can see there is already one among the attendees that, probably we have two questions from the attendee, but I've seen that Ernesto, okay, he raised his hand, he's lowered it, but now we can begin with the attendee Q&A session. We are giving the microphone to Ernesto. I can't really speak its surname, sorry. You can introduce yourself.
Restrepo, I am here in Uppsala, and I'm in my paternity leave from my work for a while. Then I decided to dedicate a little bit of time to philosophy. I'm a neuroscientist. I just would like to point something that I read in your article, that my expertise in my PhD was actually central pattern generators and locomotion. Then one of the things I read, thanks to the fact that I had some friends in France, was a book by Georges Guillaume that is called La formation du concept du réflexe, and where he actually clarified something that I think, after reading the book, I think so that you are wrong about that when you say that Descartes sketched a conception of the mechanism or reflex action so remarkable close to the contemporary accounts. And in fact, it was all, I think so, the Canguilhem present evidence that in which he described that the concept of reflex, in fact, didn't appear with Descartes. This was he said that people have been, how is it, confusing a description of the phenomena with the fundamental theory behind the concept of reflex. He also mentioned, for instance, that in the concept of reflex of Descartes, in the movement, it originates from a center, while in the concept of reflex in modern times, it is related with the periphery, and doesn't require to be conscious. Then there is quite a, I mean, he has very good work showing that, in fact, Sherrington and Franklin Fehring, when they refer to the images in the text of Descartes, they actually were mistakenly just assuming the description of the phenomena has instead of relating directly to the concept of the reflex. You see, I would suggest you to really do that analysis of that. It's not irrelevant, I think. The second point I would like to mention is I agree with Madame Curie, I think so is her name, yes. One of the most important aspects now in neuroscience is the problem of integration with issues in psychology. I would like to give you a very good example. Actually, it was not me who I come out with this idea. I just read a paper by Ian Gold and Daniel Stoliar, the Neuron Doctrine, that appeared in Behavioral Brain Science in 1999, where they very nicely show, because it's related to one question of view. You say, how can we use neuroscience to advance psychology? And in fact, the question I think is the contrary. How can we use psychology to advance neuroscience? Because look at, for instance, the case of Kandel with the synapses. You see, what is important in that case is that it was the Aplysia neurophysiological experiments make appeal to psychological concepts. You see, they appear long before then neurophysiological accounts of the reflex. You see, like in behaviorism, you know, even the associative learning there was fundamentally based in human Mills ideas, these kind of things. Then you see that there you see that neuroscience actually, in order to give an explanation, a reductionist explanation, does require psychology. Otherwise, there is not what will be able to reduce. You see, from that perspective, I do think so. Then, as Madame Curie mentioned, what is going on in certain ways is a form of integration. You know, it's an effort to integrate. Now, I read lastly, for instance, a small book by Mashal Salim, the Chicago anthropologist, called "What is Kinship?" Is pure anthropology, where he makes reference to Masello mirror neurons, for instance, in order to try to back up a little bit this idea of intersubjectivity and definition of kinship. Another book, for instance, by Galeno Strauss, or lastly, The Self, where he works more fundamentally about the concept of the self. I make use of some kind of like, he tried to account for some aspect of the universality of the self based in the principles of fundamental genetical determinants in biology. Then there is a little bit of, I think that effort might converse with you, the idea that yes, there is no one really take dualism seriously. That we agree about that. You know, it's not. But the question is that the problem of integration is where I think so. Where there is a fundamental issue. Sorry, that was my intervention. I am not a philosopher, but I appreciate very much the discussion. Bye bye.
Well, thank you, Ernesto. This was immensely helpful, and the short answer is yes and yes. On your Descartes point, you're absolutely correct. What I'm trying to the point I'm trying to make here is simply that sometimes people forget that Descartes was an excellent scientific mind, and his scientific contributions were actually cutting edge for the time. I probably overstated it in the way I put it in the paper. When I say it's remarkably close, your point is very well taken. I should hedge that claim, and again, very well taken. But the central point is that Descartes was a central scientific figure too, and I think that's in agreement with what you're saying. The second point, again, I agree. As I said in my response to Carrie, integration is crucial, but I don't think we have a good framework for integration these days. I don't pretend I've given you a complete framework, but I intend this piece as a contribution in those respects. And I also agree with you that it's not just neuroscience that can advance psychology. Psychology can advance neuroscience, and I think both questions are central. And I don't think what I've said here denies that, but you're absolutely correct. I should emphasize that. I make it sound like I'm talking, how can the lower level inform the higher level? And as you point out, the relation can go the other way. I couldn't agree more, and that should be crystal clear in my presentation and in my piece. So thank you very much.
So first of all, thanks for the presentation, Marco. But I must confess that I wasn't able to hear you for technical reason for a big part of that. So perhaps I'm just stepping in the wrong direction from the very start. So basically, this is a question of clarification. You may take it this way. My concern is about raising the mind-body problem from the angle of the philosopher of science, because it seems that, as Matteo perhaps was pointing out, there are many, so to say, dualistic problems in philosophy of science from many perspectives. It is the living beings and the oxygenation and the metabolistic effect in the cells. And so we may wonder whether this is the real explanation of life or not, or we are reducing life to metabolism in the cells or whatever. And there was a point raised by Dennett many years ago. So, or whether the reduction, molecular keen energy and temperature is a good example or not, blah, blah. So it seems that the teaching, the lesson that we can draw from the philosophy of science seems to be something like this. There are pragmatic reasons for doing certain kind of questions because there is something that we want to know, so we will restrict our interest to this or that kind of problem. And this is fine as long as it goes. But one lesson that we draw is that these pragmatic reasons are somehow short-breathed with respect to the metaphysical issues and the ontological issues that still are there from a philosophical perspective. That is, we definitely know now that there is no sense in speaking of force in terms of a muscle fatigue, but because force is mass times acceleration, that this is over. But we still seem to think that there is some difference between, feeling and the working of the amygdala. So, this is a matter of the psychology being still in its infancy, and so we just wait and see? Or do you want to say that in the case of the mind, the philosophy of science can draw a new line, which is dramatically different from physics, for instance? And that would be just saying, we really need the mind-body problem 3.0. Thanks.
I think thank you, Simone. I think you're a little cutting off towards the end, so I hope I didn't miss the tail end of your question. Because, and if I did, please jump. Can you hear me now?
Sure. Yes.
Okay. So, thank you. This is another excellent point to think about. Let me make two very brief remarks. And again, I won't be able to address every single point you make because that would be a lecture in and of itself. Because I think I want to begin with the tail end of my conversation with Philip here. One of the points I'm raising is not, or better, the main point I'm raising is not the philosophy of science has a different angle on the mind-body problem of these issues than the philosophy of mind or metaphysics. In a sense, the probably very controversial point I'm raising is that there's no such thing as the mind-body problem as you aptly put it. I think philosophy of science brings its own perspective, but we can't, it's not a different problem because there's no such thing as the mind-body problem. There was Descartes' question, there's the question of reductionism, there's many, many others. Philosophy of science has one approach, one answer, one approach to this. And so it's not, I don't want to draw the distinction you might be implying here between philosophical questions, metaphysical questions, scientific questions. Maybe I'm a full-fledged pragmatist all the way down, but I think Descartes' question was a pragmatic one. The mind-body problem 2.0, as I called it, was pragmatic, and so is mine. But I don't think there's the question behind it, if that makes any sense.
Thanks.
Thank you. Now we have Daniel Rojas Libano. I hope I haven't misspelled it.
Yeah, you're right. So can you hear me? Yeah, good. So Marco, this is I think very interesting work. This was a very nice talk. I'm not a philosopher, so I lack some background, but your description was pretty clear to me. And I had just two questions, two simple questions, I guess. One is that I don't on this problem about the independence of the higher sciences. You said like the real problem is the explanatory autonomy regarding psychology and neuroscience, and not a problem of reduction. But there I don't really see like if I claim that one set of phenomena can be reduced to other, right? Then there's no explanatory autonomy. So I can't really see that they're completely different problems, or I could see them as 2.1 or something like this, not as 2 and 3. You see. And the other very interesting point you make that I somehow missed, why you claim that what is at stake here is the relevance of philosophy for science. So that would be.
Well, thank you, Daniel. And well, for one thing, if you found the presentation clear, that's a big compliment, and I'm very happy to hear them. Thanks for your excellent questions. With respect to your first point, again, and this is something that other speakers have touched upon, and I agree with all of you guys. I need to be clear on this, but to some extent you can always quibble. Are you asking a new question, or are you rephrasing an old one? Philip said, well, what does it mean to solve a problem, and so forth. So you're right. Of course, if you can reduce something and you don't have the autonomy, the problem is that we don't have a model of reduction in philosophy of science that allows us to say exactly what it means to reduce. We had one, but the clear model is gone. And now I suspect that this new problem, so these new questions are not substantive enough. So what I'm trying to do here is find a more substantive way to rephrase these old issues. So bottom line is I agree with you. They're not different questions, but I'm hoping I'm trying to put my finger on what I take to be a more substantive disagreement. Am I allowed to call this a new problem? I don't know, but this is something we can definitely discuss, and your point is well taken. And then towards the end, well, I'm very glad that a non-philosopher, a non-professional philosopher is concerned about my claims about the role of philosophy. It just seems to me that for much of its history, philosophy, even recent history, philosophy and other disciplines have really gone hand in hand. And this, I'm sharing here my own general take on this, but it looks to me that a lot of mainstream philosophy over the last few decades has just followed its own tangent. And now it's not completely separated, but it's not essential anymore. And some philosophers are okay with it. Like, we are on our own discipline, we do our own things. I happen to disagree with this perspective. I think philosophy is not a self-standing discipline. Philosophy becomes crucial, becomes interesting, becomes important when we join forces with other people in the sciences and other humanities, with politics, with economics, and so forth. And but in order to do this, we need to make an effort to make our philosophical questions pertinent to the real world. And it seems to me that we can do better in this respect.
Many thanks.
Thank you, Daniel.
I'd like to go back to the issue about ontology versus, I don't know, epistemology or philosophy of science, just to, push a little bit the case for metaphysics. What I want to say, Marco, is that I think even if you disagree that that there is an ontological problem with the mind, I think maybe it would be interesting for all the metaphysicians in the world to still have the chance to for a discussion about the metaphysics, so the ontology that is behind the concept of autonomy. So what I'm trying to say is this. Granted that there is no mind-body problem in the sense of a hard problem of consciousness, and I would, as a reader, I would have liked you maybe to say that a bit more explicitly at the beginning of the paper, because then I would have thought, okay, all my concerns about the hard problem should be left aside, or I can think about them, but I know that this person is not completely on board with that, and it's a deflection, it's about that, which is completely understandable, actually. Yeah, very, very understandable. But then, even though you don't agree that there is a hard problem of consciousness, you might still, some people might still say, well, there is another reason why reduction doesn't work. Reduction doesn't work because reduction is a concept that comes from philosophy of science. And when you talk about reduction, you talk about reducing theories. But what we want to know here is an ontological question. How are psychological properties or mental properties related to the physical properties? And the autonomy might be spelled out in ontological terms, and I think it would be very interesting to think about what metaphysical picture is more consistent with this idea that there is autonomy, but it's a mixed autonomy. It's not full autonomy. So even if we don't talk about reduction between theories, we can still ask relevant questions about what are the relationships, what's the metaphysical relation. So we can say it's weak supervenience, it's strong supervenience, there is emergence. And it's not by chance, I think, that in the very recent debate in metaphysics, there is a sort of revival of hylomorphism, but people that work on hylomorphism are also very interested in the mechanism debate. And they think that actually mechanistic approaches need something like hylomorphism or something like a strong metaphysical approach or basis foundation to support the claims such as the mechanisms, higher order mechanisms have properties or powers that can't be explained in terms of lower level properties. So I think even if there's nothing special about consciousness, the fact that there is autonomy of one level on the other might still be an interesting question even for metaphysicians. And this could be maybe not in your, it's not your cup of tea, but maybe you could, it could be interesting to open at least the possibility to this kind instead of saying, I'm not concerned with ontology at all, I don't care about ontology, let's just talk pragmatism.
Well, thank you, Matteo, and another excellent point. Look, here, let me start with the good news. The good news is that this is work in progress. And so I'm going to take, I'm going to have the organizer send me the video, just stream it very, very slowly, take all sorts of notes, and use it to revise my paper. For one thing, you're right. I should be way more upfront, for example, about the hard problem of consciousness not being at the forefront of my project here. Yes, I couldn't agree more. But also, and what I'm going to say now, I don't know whether I'm able to say this in the paper in a non-paternalistic way, but I can give it a shot for sure. I'm not saying that there's no space for ontology and philosophy, so quite the contrary. Maybe I should rephrase my call along these lines. For all those metaphysicians of mind, metaphysicians of science out there, there's not only space for you guys in this project, we need good ontology to do good philosophy of science. But don't focus all your attention on substance dualism or reductionism or questions that are not at the forefront. We need a metaphysics of contemporary science, not a metaphysics of 1600s or 17th century science. So I couldn't agree more. What I'm hoping, I said this before, I'll say it again, I'm hoping to create a framework. Am I going to be able to make sense of autonomy or independence or explanation without ontology? Hell no. I need you guys broadly construed. But my call is, let's focus on these new questions where we really need philosophical work. Let's not focus on discarded questions. There's plenty of work to do now. Let's do that, and let's do it together. But we need to, again, as a team.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much to everybody. We are really run of time, so we really thank you again, Marco. This time we can clap.
Thank you, guys.